Welcome back, wanderers of the unknown. Tonight, we're stepping out of the classroom and into the shadows, where ordinary school trips take a terrifying turn. Field trips are supposed to be funner, chance to escape routine, explore new places, and make memories with friends. But sometimes, those memories aren't filled with laughter and discovery. These are 20 true scary field trip horror stories, chilling accounts of what happens when the bus ride doesn't end in safety. And when history, wilderness, and abandoned places decide to remind us that the living are not always the only ones present. So, grab your backpack, keep your group close, and whatever you do, don't wander off the trail. The trip to the old history museum had started like any other school outing. The students from Jefferson Middle piled off the yellow bus with the usual chatter and excitement, eager for a day away from the classroom. Their teachers had promised them a glimpse into the past exhibits filled with mannequins dressed in period clothing, artifacts that told the stories of settlers, soldiers, and families who had once called the Midwest home. The museum itself stood like a relic, an imposing stone building from the late 1800s, with narrow windows and an iron-gated entrance that creaked as it opened. Some of the children laughed nervously at the sound, but no one thought much of it. Not yet. Inside, the air was cooler, carrying the faint smell of dust and polish. Tall ceilings loomed above, and dim light filtered down from antique chandeliers. The group moved through the halls in clusters, their footsteps echoing on the wooden floors, complete with mannequins dressed in ragged clothing, her blank eyes reflecting the overhead light. A boy knelt beside her, forever caught in the pose of gathering wood. Another mannequin stood near the door, one hand raised in a wave of greeting or, perhaps warning. The students leaned close, whispering and pointing. One girl swore she saw the mannequin's hand twitch. Another said she saw the mother's eyelids flutter, just for a second. A few of the kids laughed nervously, brushing it off as tricks of the light. But as the group moved along, several couldn't shake the feeling that the glass eyes were following them. They continued through rooms filled with uniforms, tools, portraits, and displays of daily life from centuries past. The further they went, the quieter the group became. The museum felt different from others they had visited, heavier, as if the air itself carried the weight of the lives it was meant to preserve. One hallway displayed mannequins in military uniforms, their faces painted pale, their mouths stern. As the students passed, one boy turned sharply, convinced he'd seen a soldier blink. His friend laughed at him, but when he looked back, the soldier's head seemed angled just slightly differently, as though it had turned to watch them go. By the time the group reached the staircase leading down to the basement, several of the kids were already uneasy. The guide explained that the lower level contained the oldest artifacts, including items discovered in the foundations of the building itself. The lights were dimmer here, buzzing faintly as if struggling to hold back the darkness. Shadows clung to the corners, stretching unnaturally long across the cracked stone floor. The basement was colder, to an almost damp chill that made the students hug their arms. Dust coated the shelves of pottery, tools, and household relics. Behind one roped-off section stood a mannequin dressed in a black suit and top hat. Unlike the others, this one seemed to have no face. Its head was smooth, blank, a pale oval under the brim of the hat. One of the students whispered that it looked like a shadow trying to take human shape. It was near this figure that the strangeness began. At first, it seemed like an ordinary trick of the light, something shifting at the corner of the eye. But as the children walked deeper into the room, one of them stopped and gasped. Against the far wall, a shadow stretched and lengthened, peeling itself away from the stone. Slowly, it slid down to the floor, darker than the surrounding gloom. It didn't belong to any person, not even to the faceless mannequin. The students froze, their voices caught in their throats. They watched as the shadow began to move, creeping across the floor as though it were alive. Some said it resembled the outline of a man, tall and hunched, dragging itself forward. Others swore it had no shape at all, just a smear of darkness that swallowed the light around it. The footsteps they heard then heavy, deliberate, pacing scent, several kids running back toward the stairs. One boy whispered that the shadow had stopped right behind him. When he turned, there was nothing there, only the cold air pressing against his neck. The teachers quickly gathered everyone and insisted it must have been a trick, perhaps the flicker of the old lights or nerves playing games. They hurried the group up the stairs, away from the basement and its suffocating dark. But the sense of being followed didn't end. As they made their way back through the exhibits, the students whispered about footsteps echoing just behind them, though no one was there. Several glanced over their shoulders to find only empty hallways and silent mannequins frozen in their eternal poses. When they finally reached the doors, the sunlight spilling in from outside felt like a rescue. On the bus ride home, the chatter didn't return to its usual noise. The kids sat in uneasy silence, staring out the windows or huddled close to their friends. Halfway down the road, one girl gasped. She swore she heard the sound of boots stepping on the metal floor behind them, steady and slow, even though no one stood in the aisle. Others admitted later that they had heard it too, though none dared to turn around and look. By the time they reached the school, the sound had faded, but the feeling lingered. For weeks afterward, some of the children had trouble sleeping. They spoke in hushed tones about the shadow that had peeled itself from the wall, the footsteps that followed them, and the faceless mannequin that seemed to stand at the edge of their dreams. The teachers, when pressed, insisted there had been nothing unusual. But they couldn't explain the way the students recoiled when someone asked if they wanted to go back. Not one of them ever set foot in that museum again. The rain had been steady all morning, streaking down the windows of the yellow school bus as it rolled through the winding backroads of rural Pennsylvania. The 7th graders from Fairmont Middle were supposed to be heading to the State Science Center, a trip everyone had been looking forward to for weeks. For the students, it meant a break from tests and lectures, a chance to see space exhibits and interactive displays. For the teachers, it was simply another field trip to manage. At first, the drive was uneventful, rows of farmland slipping by, cows grazing under gray skies, fields shrouded in a light mist. But as the rain picked up, the bus slowed, windshield wipers squeaking across the glass. The students were restless, shifting in their seats, listening to the rumble of the engine. It was then that some of them began to notice the scenery changing. The neat fences and barns gave way to thicker clusters of trees. The road, once smooth and wide, began to narrow. One teacher at the front leaned toward the driver, a grizzled man in his 50s with a cap pulled low. "Are we still on Route 29? She asked, a note of unease in her voice. The driver didn't glance at her, just kept his eyes fixed on the road. "GPS says this way," he muttered, though the small screen mounted on the dashboard flickered uncertainly, the signal cutting in and out. Minutes stretched on. The kids pressed their faces to the windows, frowning at the trees that now pressed close to the roadside. Fog began to thicken, seeping in from the woods, until the road seemed little more than a narrow strip carved into an endless tunnel of gray. Whispers spread among the students. "We should have been there by now. Why are there no signs? This doesn't look right." Even the teachers began exchanging uneasy looks. Finally, the road widened slightly, curving around a bend. The fog parted just enough to reveal what lay ahead. Instead of the bright glass and steel of the Science Center, a sagging farmhouse loomed at the end of a gravel drive. Its windows were broken, shards of glass hanging like jagged teeth. The paint had peeled away in long strips, revealing weathered wood beneath. The front door hung askew on rusted hinges, creaking with every gust of wind. The bus slowed to a crawl. As it came to a stop in front of the property, the children fell silent, their chatter dying as they stared out at the ruin. The rain pattered on the roof, steady and relentless, the only sound in the sudden stillness. One boy in the back whispered, "This doesn't feel right." The driver rubbed his jaw, his expression unreadable. "Must have taken a wrong turn," he said gruffly, though his voice lacked conviction. He put the bus in reverse, tires crunching on the gravel as he prepared to turn around. That was when someone screamed. The sound came from a girl near the front, who pointed upward with a trembling hand. Dozens of eyes followed her gesture, and what they saw froze them where they sat. In the upstairs window of the farmhouse, half shrouded by the fog and the curtain of rain, a pale figure stood. It wasn't moving, but it was unmistakably there, a tall, thin shape with hollow features pressed to the glass. Its skin was almost white, blending with the mist outside. Gasps rippled through the bus. A few students ducked down in their seats. Others pressed closer to the windows, trying to see more clearly. The figure didn't shift, didn't blink, didn't raise a hand. It only watched. The driver swore under his breath, his knuckles tightening on the wheel. The teachers scrambled to calm the students, telling them it was just a trick of the rain, a shadow, nothing to be afraid of. But even as they spoke, their voices betrayed doubt. The bus lurched as the driver finally pulled it away from the farmhouse. Backing down the gravel drive and turning sharply back onto the road, the students craned their necks to look through the rear windows, and several swore. The figure moved, then tilting its head, watching them go. The ride back was heavy with unease. The fog didn't lift, as if the woods themselves were reluctant to let them leave. The students whispered about the farmhouse, about the face in the window, about the possibility that someone or something still lived inside. Finally, the trees parted, and familiar landmarks came into view. Gas stations, road signs, small shops. The bus rejoined the main road, and before long, the sign center appeared ahead, its bright banners fluttering in the drizzle. Relief spread through the bus, though it didn't erase the memory of what they had seen. Later that evening, after the field trip ended and the students returned home, the stories began to spread. Some claimed the figure had been a ghost of a farmer who once lived there, a man who had died alone and never left. Others said it was something older, something that had never been human at all, trapped in the decaying house. A few insisted the bus had taken a wrong turn by accident, that the road had pulled them there, guiding them toward the farmhouse on purpose. When the juniors from Westbrook High stepped off their buses onto the grounds of the old Civil War battlefield, the grass was wet with dew, and a thin mist clung stubbornly to the earth, as though the land itself refused to release the memories of what had happened there. Rows of white markers dotted the fields, stretching off into the distance. The teachers reminded the students that thousands of soldiers had died on this soil, their lives cut short in one of the most brutal battles of the war. For most of the kids, the trip was just another excuse to skip class, but a few felt the weight of the place immediately, thicker than they were used to, broken only by the occasional call of a crow circling above. The guide, a gray-haired man in a weathered coat, began leading the group down a worn path that snaked through tall grass and scattered cannons left as monuments. As they walked, he described troop movements, the chaos of musket fire, the screams of the wounded. The students listened half-heartedly, their attention wandering, until one of them noticed something unusual. Toward the back of the group, a girl had fallen in step with them. At first, no one thought much of it. Maybe she was from another school, another tour. But when someone glanced at her closely, the strangeness became clear. Her clothes were wrong. She wore a simple, faded dress that looked straight out of the 1800s. A bonnet pulled low over her face. She didn't carry a backpack, didn't have a water bottle or a phone like the others. She just walked silently, head slightly bowed, moving with the group as though she had always been there. A few students tried whispering questions to her, asking her name, what school she was from. She didn't respond. She didn't even look at them. Her lips stayed pressed together, her eyes fixed on the path ahead. Her silence made the others uneasy, but it was easier to assume she was part of another tour than to press further. The battlefield stretched wide around them, rolling hills scattered with monuments and old stone walls. The guide stopped frequently, pointing to spots where the fighting had been thickest. At each stop, the students gathered in a circle, listening while he painted pictures of chaos and bloodshed. And each time, the strange girl stood with them, lingering at the edges. She was close enough to be counted as part of the group, yet somehow always apart, a little too quiet, a little too still. By midday, the students had grown used to her presence, though none of them could recall seeing her climb off their bus. A few simply assumed she must have joined with another class and gotten mixed in by accident. Still, something about her unsettled them. Her dress was too clean, too perfect, as though untouched by time. And when she passed through the mist that hung in patches across the field, her figure seemed to blur, as if she were fading in and out with the fog. It wasn't until later, near the end of the tour, that the first real shiver of fear struck the group. They had stopped near a cluster of trees, the guide telling them about the final desperate charge of a regiment that had been slaughtered to the last man. As he spoke, one boy swore he saw the girl step behind a tree. He thought she was simply breaking away from the group. But when he went to look, she wasn't there. The clearing was empty, the grass untouched, and the mist thickened just enough to obscure the space. He didn't mention it right away, not wanting to sound foolish. Yet when the roll was called, before heading back to the buses, the teachers counted every student present. The numbers were correct. No one was missing. No one extra had been noted. It was only once the buses were on the road, the rain beginning to streak the windows, that one of the teachers decided to double-check the attendance sheets. She called each name carefully, waiting for the students to respond with "here." The kids answered one by one, their voices tired but steady. When she finished the list, one of the boys raised his hand hesitantly. "You forgot someone," he said. "The girl in the dress." The teacher frowned. "What girl?" "The one who was walking with us all day," another chimed in. "The one in the old-fashioned clothes." Murmurs spread through the bus. Several students confirmed it. They had seen her, walked beside her, even tried to talk to her. The teachers exchanged nervous glances. "No one like that was with us," one insisted. "We only brought our own students." The confusion deepened into silence. A few kids insisted on pulling out their phones, scrolling through pictures they had taken on the battlefield. Most of the images were what you would expect: cannons, monuments, wide shots of the fields. But in one photo, taken near the stone wall, there she was. The girl in the faded dress stood at the edge of the frame, her face partially hidden by her bonnet. Her skin looked pale, almost translucent, as though the fog behind her were seeping into her body. The bus grew quiet as everyone leaned in to see. The girl hadn't posed for the picture, hadn't even seemed to know it was being taken. She was simply there, blending among them, as though she belonged to another time. By the time the buses rolled back into the school parking lot, no one was laughing or joking anymore. The students shuffled off, shaken, whispering about the girl who had vanished without a trace. Later, research revealed that civilians, women, children, and townsfolk had been caught in the crossfire of the battle. Some had wandered the fields afterward, searching for loved ones, never to be seen again. The students couldn't shake the thought that one of those restless souls had joined them, silently walking the paths she had known more than a century before. The buses had pulled into the parking lot just after noon, their engines growling against the stillness of the Kentucky hills. A group of middle school students piled out, chattering with excitement at the thought of exploring the famous limestone cave system they had been hearing about all semester. The teachers rounded them up, reminding everyone to stay with the guide, not to wander off, and above all else, not to touch the walls of the cave. The entrance loomed at the edge of the forest, a jagged mouth in the hillside that exhaled cool air into the summer heat. The students laughed and shivered as they stepped through, their sneakers crunching on damp gravel. Instantly, the world outside disappeared, swallowed by stone. The guide, a tall man with a lantern and an easy smile, assured them the caves were perfectly safe. "These passages have stood for millions of years," he said. "All you need to do is stick together." At first, the tour was more fascinating than frightening. Some of them glittering faintly in the guide's light, stalagmites jutted from the ground like crooked teeth. Their voices echoed strangely, bouncing back in warped tones. A few kids laughed at the sound of their own giggles echoing into the dark, while others stuck closer to the teachers. The deeper they went, the more oppressive the silence became. The air cooled to the point where many of the students crossed their arms for warmth. The guide's lantern revealed winding corridors that twisted away into the blackness, places he told them were sealed off for safety. "Some tunnels go on for miles," he said. "It's easy to get lost if you stray too far." Eventually, the group reached a vast chamber where the ceiling soared high above, the walls marked by mineral streaks. Here, the guide decided to give them a demonstration. He raised his lantern, looked around the group, and said, "I want to show you what complete darkness feels like. When I turn off the light, don't panic, just stand still. In here, without light, you'll understand what true blackness really is." The students murmured nervously, but curiosity outweighed their fear. The guide lifted his hand, then lowered it, and the lantern flicked off. Instantly, the cave swallowed everything. The children had never known such darkness. It wasn't simply dim. It was total, absolute, pressing in on their eyes until they weren't even sure they had their lids open. Gasps rippled through the group. A few reached out blindly, clutching at their friends' arms, and then the screams began. They didn't come from the students. They came from somewhere deeper in the tunnels, from passages no one had entered. The sound tore through the silence, high and desperate, echoing along the stone walls. It wasn't one scream, but many men, women, maybe even children layered together in a rising wail that made the air vibrate in their chests. The students froze. Some started crying. A teacher whispered sharply for the guide to turn the light back on. The guide fumbled with the lantern, his hand shaking more than he wanted to admit. When the flame flared back to life, the chamber looked the same, empty and still. But the echoes of those screams still clung to the walls, bouncing off the stone as though the cave itself remembered the sound. The guide forced a laugh, though his face had gone pale. "Wind," he said quickly. "It was just the wind rushing through the tunnels. It can sound strange down here." But none of the children believed him. They had heard fear in those voices, the kind that no wind could imitate. He hurried them out, pushing the pace faster than before. The lantern's glow bobbed quickly ahead, casting jittery shadows that leaped and vanished with every step. The students stumbled to keep up, too afraid to lag behind, too scared to look back into the black corridors branching away from them. As they drew closer to the surface, the cool air shifted, carrying with it faint echoes that refused to die. Even as they climbed toward the faint outline of daylight, some swore they could still hear the distant cries, softer now, as if calling after them. By the time they stepped into the open air, the warmth of the sun felt unreal, like waking from a nightmare. The teachers tried to reassure the children, repeating the guide's explanation. They said caves had strange acoustics, that the mind played tricks in the dark. The guide himself muttered excuses about drafts and pressure changes. But when one student asked him directly if he had ever heard screams like that before, the man hesitated just a second too long before answering no. The ride back on the bus was quieter than anyone expected. The kids stared out the rain-streaked windows, clutching their backpacks, unwilling to speak of what they'd heard. Some whispered later that the screams hadn't just been random. They thought they heard words buried in the noise, pleas for help, cries for mercy, fragments of sentences too broken to understand. Others claimed that when the lantern came back on, for a split second, they'd seen shapes in the darkness, figures pressed against the walls of the cavern, vanishing as quickly as they appeared. The story spread through the school after the trip. Some dismissed it as exaggeration, kids spooking each other in the dark. But the ones who had been there didn't waver in their memories. They all remembered the sound draw, human and agonized. The decommissioned prison loomed over the group as the school bus pulled to a stop, its gray stone walls scarred with time and rust streaking down from barred windows. For decades, this place had held some of the most dangerous men in the state. But now it was marketed as a historic landmark, where tourists could walk the same halls, once patrolled by guards and filled with clanging chains. The students were uneasy the moment they stepped through the gates. The air was heavy, thick with a smell of mildew and iron, as if the building itself still remembered the lives it had swallowed. The guide, a tall man with a booming voice, tried to lighten the mood with jokes about ghosts and restless inmates. His words echoed strangely down the cavernous corridors, bouncing off peeling walls and rusted bars. The group shuffled into the first cell block, their sneakers squeaking against the cracked concrete floor. Rows of cells stretched above and below, like open mouths in a silent scream. The kids whispered nervously to each other, daring one another to peek inside the cells that still bore scratch marks on the walls and graffiti etched by desperate hands. Among the group was a boy named Tyler, curious and a little braver than most. He drifted toward the back of the group, his eyes drawn to the cells that yawned open like doorways into the past. As the guide spoke about overcrowding and prison riots, Tyler barely listened. A faint metallic clang had caught his attention. At first, he thought it was just an echo from their own footsteps, but it came again sharp, deliberate, and close. He turned his head toward the sound and saw, down the row, one cell door slightly ajar, swaying back and forth as if someone had just let it go. Drawn by something he couldn't explain, Tyler stepped away from the others. The voices of his classmates grew fainter as he approached the cell. He ran his hand along the cold bars, his breath fogging in the cool air. The clang came again, and before he could think twice, he stepped inside. The cell was small, barely large enough for a bed and a toilet, both corroded with rust. He peered at the walls, noticing the faint scratches that looked less like graffiti and more like tally marks. Dozens, maybe hundreds of them, climbing up the stone. Suddenly, the heavy door slammed shut behind him with a deafening bang. Tyler jumped, his heart hammering in his chest. He grabbed the bars, shaking them, but they wouldn't budge. His classmates gasped and crowded around, their voices a mixture of laughter and panic. "Hey, it locked," someone shouted. The guide hurried over, his face pale as he pulled at the door. "It shouldn't have closed," the guide muttered, fumbling with a large keyring. He slid a key into the lock, twisted it, and pulled. Nothing. Another key, another attempt. The door stayed firmly shut, as if the rusted metal had fused itself together. Tyler's classmates pressed against the bars, calling his name, but Tyler barely heard them, because inside the cell, pressed close to his ear, there was a voice. It was low, whispering words he couldn't fully understand, like a hiss slipping through the cracks in the world. His skin crawled, goosebumps prickling his arms. He tried to cover his ears, but the voice grew louder, sharper, cutting into his mind. It wasn't just one voice. It was several, overlapping, muttering, arguing, crying. He could feel warm breath against his neck, though no one stood behind him. The guide tugged harder, sweat beading on his forehead. The students shouted encouragement, but the door held firm. Tyler, trembling, pressed against the wall to get away from the phantom whispers. His breathing grew rapid, his chest tight, and in the chaos, he finally caught a single clear word in the chorus of whispers. "Stay." The word slithered into his ear like a command. He clawed at the wall, panic surging through him, desperate to get out. His classmates pounded on the bars, their voices growing more frantic as they saw the color drain from his face. And then, as suddenly as it had closed, the lock clicked. The door swung open on its own, the sound of the latch echoing like a final exhale. The guide stumbled back, his keys still useless in his hand. Tyler bolted from the cell, nearly knocking over a classmate as he ran back into the middle of the group. His eyes were wide, his skin pale, his hands trembling so badly he couldn't speak. "What happened?" someone asked, but Tyler just shook his head. He wouldn't say it out loud, not with the feeling that those whispers might still be listening. Only later, once they were back on the bus, did he finally whisper the truth to his best friend. "They wouldn't stop talking," he said, voice shaking. "All of them, whispering in my ear. And one of them told me to stay." The prison tour went on, but no one laughed at the guide's ghost jokes anymore. They stuck close together, refusing to wander, their eyes darting to every shadow that stretched too long across the cell block. The guide avoided that row entirely, rushing them along with nervous energy, as if eager to get them out before anything else happened. The school bus pulled up to the state park with the usual clamor of excited children pressing their faces against the windows. It was supposed to be a cheerful field trip, the kind of outing teachers looked forward to as much as the students. A walk through the park's nature trail, some lessons on plants and wildlife, a picnic lunch, and then the ride home. The crisp air of early autumn carried the scent of wet leaves and pine needles, and the children, with clipboards and paper in hand, bounded off the bus, eager to start their adventure. The teachers gathered them at the entrance to the trail, reviewing the rules. Stay with the group. Don't run ahead. Don't touch animals or plants you don't recognize. Parents had signed permission slips, and the state park guide assured them the trail was safe and well-traveled. Everyone seemed relaxed as they set off beneath the canopy of trees. For the first half hour, everything went smoothly. The children pointed out squirrels darting through the undergrowth and shouted when they spotted a woodpecker high above. A guide explained how the stream that wound through the woods had once been part of a logging route in the 1800s. Teachers called for order every now and then, but the kids were too busy being curious to cause real trouble. It wasn't until they stopped for water that someone noticed a boy was missing. He wasn't one of the louder students, but he was well-liked, quiet, curious, always sketching in his notebook. His name was Daniel. At first, the teachers assumed he had wandered a few steps off the trail to look at a plant or insect. They called his name, voices echoing through the trees, but no answer came. The group split into smaller search parties. Some retraced the path back toward the entrance, while others ventured carefully into the underbrush. With every passing minute, unease grew. The woods were not especially large, but for a child to vanish without anyone seeing was unsettling. The teacher's calls grew louder, sharper, edged with panic. "Daniel! Daniel! Answer us!" An hour passed. The other students grew restless, some beginning to cry. The guide tried to assure everyone that no one ever truly got lost here, that the boy must be close by. Still, fear gnawed at the adults. Finally, one of the teachers heard the faint sound of crying. Following it, they found Daniel sitting beside the stream, his sneakers soaked, his face streaked with tears. Relief swept through them, but as soon as they reached him, his story stopped them cold. Between sobs, Daniel insisted that an old man had led him there. He said the man had taken his hand and told him he knew a shortcut, that he would show him something special by the water. Daniel followed because the man's voice was calm, gentle, and he looked kind. But when they reached the stream and Daniel turned to thank him, the man was gone. The teachers exchanged uneasy glances. None of the search parties had seen anyone else in the woods. The guide shook his head firmly, insisting no park staff fit that description, and no other visitors had entered the trail that morning. Daniel was adamant, though. He described the man in detail. Tall, with a weathered face, a gray coat, and hands that felt cold, even though the day was warm. "He told me not to worry," Daniel whispered, "that he would take care of me." The adults gently asked if maybe Daniel had imagined it, frightened after losing sight of the group. But Daniel shook his head violently. He was certain of what he had seen and felt. He even insisted that the man had spoken his name, though he never remembered telling it to him. The boy was returned to the group, but the field trip ended early. Teachers, tense and watchful, led everyone back to the bus. They counted the children twice, then 3 times, before finally leaving the park. Daniel sat quietly on the ride home, staring out the window, clutching his sketchbook to his chest. When the teachers informed his parents later, they were alarmed, but strangely unsurprised. His mother mentioned that Daniel had spoken once before about the old man in the woods, after a family picnic in the same park months earlier. They had brushed it off as childhood imagination. But after today, it didn't feel so easy to dismiss. Over the years, other stories have surfaced from visitors to that same state park. Hikers have reported seeing a figure standing at the edge of the trail, an elderly man in a gray coat who vanishes when approached. Campers have heard footsteps outside their tents. Park staff, when asked, mention an old local legend, a hermit who lived by the stream decades ago, long before the area became a park. Some say he drowned there under mysterious circumstances. The children from that field trip grew up, but many still remember the fear of that day. The way Daniel's voice shook as he described the cold hand leading him away. Some of them refused to visit that park again. As for Daniel himself, he rarely speaks about it anymore, except to say that he still dreams of the old man, sometimes dreams where the figure calls his name from the trees, always asking him to follow. The old hotel stood tall against the skyline, its brick walls weathered but dignified, its lobby filled with ornate woodwork and chandeliers that seemed to glow with a golden haze. A school group was staying there for the night during an overnight field trip, their teachers having reserved several floors for the students. The hotel, built in the early 1900s, was full of character, the kind of place with patterned carpets, brass fixtures, and hallways that stretched long and quiet after dark. To the students, it felt like an adventure staying somewhere with such history. where each creak of the floorboards seemed to carry a story of its own. Among the students were two girls, curious and mischievous, who decided that bedtime rules didn't apply to them. After lights out, when their classmates were supposed to be tucked into bed, they slipped quietly from their room and made their way down the hall. The teachers' rooms were at the far end, and as long as they kept quiet, no one would hear them. Their destination was the elevator, a grand old lift with mirrored walls, brass rails, and the faint hum of machinery that seemed far older than they were. They giggled as they stepped inside, the polished floor cooled beneath their sneakers. One of them pressed a button, then another, until nearly all of them were lit. The elevator doors closed with a heavy groan, and the car began its slow ascent. They whispered to each other, daring each other to press more buttons, to see if they could stop the elevator between floors. The ride felt oddly suspenseful, the way the machine creaked and jerked as though it carried the weight of decades of memories. Then, without warning, the elevator shuddered. The lights flickered, dimming until the car was bathed in a dull orange glow. It stopped not at a floor, but somewhere in between. The girls froze, their laughter fading. One pressed a door open button, then another, but nothing happened. The elevator hummed faintly, as though the building itself were breathing around them. That's when they noticed the mirrors. The walls reflected their nervous faces, their shifting feet. But there was something else, too. In the back reflection, between them, stood the shape of a man. He wore an old-fashioned suit, neat and crisp, and atop his head sat a bowler hat. His face was pale, almost gray, and his eyes seemed hollow, watching them with a steady gaze. The girls gasped and spun around, but the elevator was empty. No one stood behind them. They looked back at the mirror, and there he was, again motionless, silent, lingering as though he had been there all along. One of the girls reached out a hand, trembling, touching the mirrored glass. Her fingertips met only cold surface, but in the reflection, the man's hand twitched, as though he might move. Panic surged in their throats. They pressed every button they could find, desperate for the elevator to respond. The car jolted, lights flickering harder now, shadows stretching across the walls. For a moment, the reflection wavered, and the man's lips seemed to part, forming words they couldn't hear. Then the elevator lurched, and the doors creaked open to reveal a dimly lit hallway. They stumbled out without hesitation, their hearts pounding, leaving the man's silent figure behind in the mirrored glass. The hallway they stepped into wasn't the one they had come from. It was darker, the wallpaper old and peeling, the carpet threadbare. The girls exchanged nervous glances, their breaths quick and shallow. Everything felt off, as though they had stepped into a forgotten part of the hotel. They hurried down the corridor, searching for a staircase, any sign of familiarity. At last, they found a door that led back to the stairwell, the familiar hum of voices from other floors guiding them back to safety. When they returned to their room, their classmates were fast asleep. They crawled into bed, shaken and silent, agreeing not to tell anyone what had happened. Yet neither could sleep. They kept replaying the reflection in their minds. The man's unblinking stare, his presence so real yet impossible. The next morning, bleary-eyed, they joined their classmates for breakfast in the hotel's dining room. A framed display of historic photographs hung on the wall near the entrance. Among them was an image that made the girls stop in their tracks. It showed the hotel lobby in the early 1900s, filled with guests in period attire. And there, near the elevator, stood a man in a bowler hat, his suit crisp, his expression eerily familiar. They didn't need to say a word to each other. They knew it was him, the man from the mirror, the figure who had been trapped with them in the elevator. The photograph's caption mentioned no names, just that the picture had been taken not long after the hotel first opened. But the girls were certain. They had seen him, and he had seen them. Even after they left the hotel later that day, they couldn't shake the feeling. Elevators never felt the same again. Mirrors carried a new sense of unease, and the memory of that silent man in the bowler hat lingered like a shadow they couldn't escape. And though they never spoke of it to the teachers, to their classmates, or even much to each other, the experience etched itself deep into their minds. A reminder that some places hold more than just history. They hold the people who never left. The university library had always carried a sense of reverence, its marble columns and vast stone steps evoking a seriousness that made even the most restless of students fall silent. On the day of the field trip, a group of high school juniors arrived with their teachers, buzzing with the restless excitement of being away from class, but tempered by the intimidating silence of the place. The librarians, dressed neatly in cardigans and suits, guided them through long aisles filled with shelves that seemed to stretch toward the ceiling, heavy with centuries of knowledge. Dust motes swirled in the light that streamed through stained glass windows, giving the building the quiet majesty of a cathedral. As part of the tour, the students were shown a rare books room, a section of the library closed off to the public and reserved for special academic research. The room was cooler than the rest of the building, the air carrying a faint smell of old parchment and leather. Locked glass cases lined the walls, holding texts so old and delicate that even touching them could cause damage. A sense of awe spread through the group, and even the students who had spent most of the morning whispering jokes grew quiet. One student, a boy named Daniel, lagged behind as the group shuffled toward the next exhibit. He was a quiet kid by nature, often more absorbed in thought than in chatter. Something about the room captivated him. His eyes drifted to an unassuming leather-bound journal resting open on a lectern in the center of the room. Unlike the books locked away behind glass, this one seemed meant for display. Its cracked spine and yellowed pages lit gently by a spotlight overhead. Daniel lingered. The handwriting across the pages was neat yet hurried, as though the writer had been desperate to record thoughts before they slipped away. He leaned closer, tracing the faded ink with his eyes. But before he could focus on the words, the pages began to shift. Slowly at first, then more deliberately, the brittle sheets turned on their own. He stepped back, his breath catching in his throat. The tour guide and the rest of the class were too far down the hall to notice. The journal stopped at a page near the center. Daniel forced himself closer, every hair on his arms standing on end. The words were scrawled larger here, jagged as though carved in ink rather than written. His eyes scanned the passage, and his stomach dropped. It read, "I am still here." For a moment, the room seemed to contract around him. The air grew heavy, pressing against his chest, and the shadows in the corners of the rare books room deepened. A faint scratching noise filled the silence, like nails dragging slowly across paper. Daniel froze, his gaze darting from the journal to the cases around him, half expecting something or someone to emerge. The scratching grew louder, then stopped abruptly. A sharp slam echoed through the room as the journal's cover snapped shut with a force far too strong for its fragile binding. Daniel jumped back, colliding with one of the display cases. The impact sent vibrations through the glass, and for a fleeting second, he thought he saw movement inside shadows shifting against the spines of the locked-away books, as though something inside them stirred. Panic overtook him, and he let out a sharp scream. The sound tore through the silent hall and carried out to the tour group. The teacher, startled, rushed back into the room. Daniel stood pale and trembling in front of the lectern, his eyes fixed on the closed journal. "What happened?" the teacher demanded, glancing quickly around the room. Daniel pointed toward the lectern, his words tangled and panicked. "The book, it moved. It turned the pages, and then it wrote something," it said. But when the teacher approached, the journal was neatly closed, its leather cover unbroken, its pages untouched. No sign of the jagged handwriting remained. The teacher frowned, lifting it carefully, but it would not open. The pages seemed sealed together as though fused by time. The rest of the students crowded into the doorway, their whispers filling the room. Daniel's face burned with fear and confusion as they looked at him, some with skepticism, others with wide-eyed unease. "It must have been your imagination," the teacher said gently, setting the journal back on the lectern. But even as she spoke, her eyes flickered uneasily toward the book, her voice betraying doubt. The group moved on, but Daniel couldn't shake the sensation that the room had not let him go. As they left, he glanced over his shoulder one last time. For the briefest moment, he swore he saw the cover of the journal lift slightly, as though stirred by an unseen hand. That night, back at home, Daniel lay awake, replaying the event in his mind. The weight of the words, "I am still here," haunted him. He wondered who had written them and why the message had been directed at him. The image of the pages turning on their own seared itself into his thoughts. Weeks later, the memory had not faded. He returned to the library on his own, slipping quietly into the rare books room when no one was watching. The journal was still there on the lectern, closed tight. He reached out, hesitating, his hand hovering above the cover. Just as his fingers brushed the leather, the faint scratching returned. It came from inside the book, relentless, urgent as though something trapped within was trying to claw its way out. Daniel yanked his hand back, his heart racing, and the noise stopped as suddenly as it had begun. The school buses rumbled along the winding road, kicking up dust as they approached the state park in Oregon. A group of 7th graders from Cedar Ridge Middle School buzzed with excitement, ready for their first overnight camping trip. Teachers reminded them to stay together, not to wander too far from the site, and to respect the forest around them. The tall pines and thick underbrush loomed over the campsite as the students piled out, backpacks slung over their shoulders and sleeping bags in hand. The campgrounds were nestled at the edge of a dense forest, the kind that seemed to stretch endlessly, dark and shadowed even in daylight. The teachers assigned tents, helped the students set up camp, and made sure everyone had the supplies they needed. As evening fell, the campers gathered around the fire, roasting marshmallows, telling stories, and laughing. The forest was alive with the sounds of birds calling to each other and the occasional rustle of small animals in the underbrush, but the students paid it little mind. After dinner, the teachers reminded the kids to return to their tents for the night. The forest darkened quickly, and even the firelight seemed weak against the gathering shadows. The students crawled into their sleeping bags, chattering softly as they tried to settle down. The wind whispered through the trees, moving the branches in slow, swaying motions. For a while, the sounds were nothing more than natural background noise until they weren't. A few hours into the night, some of the students began to stir. At first, it was subtle, a faint whisper here, a rustling there. Then the voices became clearer. Names were being called, low and urgent, almost pleading. Mia, Alex, Tyler. The kids jolted upright, whispering to one another in panic. The teachers were quickly alerted and grabbed flashlights, stepping out of their tents to investigate. The beams of light cut through the darkness, illuminating the ground and the nearest trunks, but no one was there. Not a single student, not another adult, no camper out of place. Just the forest, thick and silent now, except for the soft groan of the wind and the occasional snap of a twig. The teachers shined their lights down paths and between trees, calling for anyone who might be playing a prank. Nothing responded. Every tent was secure, every camper accounted for. One of the teachers, trying to calm the frightened students, suggested that the wind might be carrying the echoes of their own voices or noises from animals. But even as they spoke, the whispers returned. This time they were louder, closer, and unmistakable. The names were being called again, drawn out in strange lilting tones that seemed to stretch unnaturally across the campsite. Some students claimed the whispers came from just beyond the tents, from places they could not see. Shadows flickered at the edges of the flashlight beams, moving as though the trees themselves were bending toward. The campers, one of the teachers, determined to find the source, walked further into the forest. Each step seemed to amplify the whispers, the voices weaving together in an impossible chorus that pressed against their minds. The words didn't always make sense. They were sometimes mixed with strange sounds, like wind over rocks. But the students listening from their tents insisted the forest was speaking to them directly. The teacher called the students to stay in their tents and shone the flashlight deeper into the trees. The forest was dense, gnarled roots, and thick underbrush, making it nearly impossible to see far. Yet the whispers seemed to follow them, drifting around in the dark, coming from every direction at once. It was as though the forest itself was alive, its trees leaning in to watch, to listen, to speak. The night dragged on. No matter how far the teacher walked or how loud they called, the whispers never ceased. They called names over and over, sometimes softly, sometimes almost screaming. The children huddled in their sleeping bags, holding hands, shivering, afraid to close their eyes. Occasionally, a branch would snap sharply nearby, and the whispers would rise in panic, repeating names faster, overlapping, a tide of sound that refused to break. By the time the first hints of dawn appeared, the voices had grown faint, fading slowly as the gray light spread through the forest. The students emerged from their tents, pale and exhausted, glancing warily at the shadows of the trees. Teachers confirmed that everyone was present, no one was missing, and yet the memory of the night lingered in every mind. Even during breakfast, the students spoke in hushed tones, exchanging stories of the whispers they heard, the strange shapes at the edges of their vision, and the feeling of being watched by something unseen. No one could explain it, and the teachers had little more than reassurances to offer. Sometimes the forest plays tricks. Shadows deceive. The mind imagines shapes in the dark, but none of the students were convinced. In the years that followed, many of the students would recall the night vividly. They could hear the whispers in their dreams, names carried on the wind, leaves rustling unnaturally in the corners of their rooms. Some refused to camp again. Others avoided forests entirely, unwilling to risk returning to the place where the trees had seemed to speak directly to them. Even the teachers, though skeptical, carried unease from that night. The forest had not harmed them physically, but it had left something behind, a lingering sense of awareness that the shadows are not always empty, that the wind sometimes carries voices meant to be heard, and that the trees, tall and silent in daylight, might have been whispering all along. The memory of that night in Oregon stayed with the students for decades. They remembered names called shadows moving, and the unshakable feeling that the forest had its own presence, watching, listening, whispering, and waiting. Even when the sun rose, and the world seemed normal again, the whispers remained in their minds, a chilling reminder that some places hold more than just trees. They hold secrets that refuse to stay buried. The cathedral in Seville rose against the Spanish sky, its spires piercing the clouds, its stone walls ancient and weathered by centuries of wind and sun. A group of high school students from an exchange program stepped through the heavy wooden doors, their shoes echoing across the polished floors. They had heard of the cathedral's grandeur, its intricate carvings, stained glass windows, and rich history, but nothing could have prepared them for the quiet, solemn beauty of the interior. Sunlight streamed through the colored glass, casting shifting patterns across the floor, while the scent of incense lingered in the air. Their guide, a nervous man with spectacles that slid down his nose, led them through the nave, pointing out statues, paintings, and altars. Students whispered to one another, taking notes and photographs, eager to capture everything for school projects. The group moved slowly, absorbing the details of each sculpture, each carved figure frozen in marble. Then they reached a small chapel off to the side, dimly lit and almost hidden behind an ornate archway. There, on a pedestal at eye level, stood a marble statue of a saint. The figure was delicate and lifelike, the folds of the robe carved with painstaking precision, the face serene and calm. But as the students gathered closer, a chill ran through the air. Something about the statue made them uneasy. Several students gasped. Red streaks ran down the saint's cheeks. At first, they thought it was paint, or perhaps remnants of some decoration left behind. But the streaks glistened unnaturally in the light, like liquid, pooling faintly at the base of the marble chin. The girl at the front of the group stepped closer, squinting at the figure. It's bleeding, she whispered. Her voice trembled as she tried to convince herself she was imagining it. The guide, sensing the group's growing unease, cleared his throat and forced a smile. "Ah, yes," he said quickly, his hands fluttering as if swatting away the idea. It's just the way the light falls. Marble sometimes reflects red tones from the stained glass. A trick of the sun, nothing more. But the students weren't convinced. Several moved around the statue, viewing it from different angles. The red streaks remained, and with every step, it seemed as though they had moved slightly, as if the liquid was fresh, as if it had just appeared. The temperature of the room seemed to drop, and the murmurs of the group hushed into uneasy silence. One of the girls, eager to document the moment, lifted her camera, and snapped a photo. The flash briefly lit the statue, highlighting the crimson trails running down the cheeks. She lowered the camera, staring at the image on the small screen. The red streaks were there, vivid and undeniable, far more pronounced than in the dim light of the chapel. She pointed it out to the guide, expecting some explanation. The guide's face tightened. He whispered something in Spanish to another staff member nearby, glancing nervously at the students. "It's just condensation," he said, avoiding eye contact. "Marble sometimes absorbs moisture differently. There's no cause for alarm." His voice trembled slightly, betraying the fact that he didn't believe his own words. He ushered the students out of the chapel quickly, his hand waving for them to continue down the hall. The students left, though the image of the bleeding statue clung to their minds. As they walked, they debated what they had seen. Some insisted it had to be a natural phenomenon, a trick of light and moisture. Others whispered that it might be something far more sinister, a miracle or a warning from the saint. The girl who had taken the photo kept the camera in her lap, staring at the screen repeatedly. Each time she looked, the red streaks seemed to shimmer faintly, as though they were alive. Later that evening, in the hostel where the students stayed, she showed the photo to her friends. They crowded around, their faces pale in the glow of the phone's screen. The image was unmistakable, the marble face of the saint, serene in expression, yet with tears of deep red streaming down the cheeks. Every angle captured the same eerie detail, a phenomenon that could not be explained by light or reflection. The students couldn't stop thinking about it. Some joked nervously, suggesting the saint was crying for something terrible that had happened, or perhaps for something yet to come. Others were genuinely frightened, unable to shake the feeling that they had witnessed something supernatural. Even the teachers, who had tried to dismiss the occurrence during the visit, confessed later that they felt a strange unease when recalling the chapel. Over the following days, the story spread quietly among the students. Those who had seen it swore it had been real, the tears of blood vivid and tangible in their minds. The girl who had taken the photo kept it hidden from adults, afraid that anyone else might try to explain it away, that the evidence of something beyond explanation might be dismissed. Years later, some of the students returned to Seville, hoping to see the statue again. The chapel appeared empty and ordinary, the red streaks gone. Yet the memory lingered, the chill of the air, the way the liquid had shimmered, the sense that the saint had watched them with eyes that were not entirely marble. The photo remained, a silent record of a moment when the sacred and the impossible had brushed against their lives, a reminder that some things cannot be explained away by reason or light. The railway museum sat at the edge of a sleepy town, its grounds lined with rusted locomotives, old boxcars, and miles of abandoned tracks. On a crisp autumn morning, a group of high school students arrived for a field trip, chattering excitedly as they spilled from the bus. The teachers reminded them to stay together, to watch their step along the uneven rails, and to respect the historic equipment on display. The museum guide, a wiry man with a weathered face and a love of railroad history, greeted them warmly, leading the way down the rows of locomotives that once powered the town's commerce. The students followed, snapping photos, asking questions, and marveling at the massive engines. Some cars were open for tours, their metal interiors cold and echoing with every footstep. The guide spoke of the golden age of railroads, of towns built around depots, and of the engineers who had risked their lives on the iron tracks. The group's attention wandered, as teenagers' minds often do, until they reached a section of the museum that led away from the main display area where the rails stretched into the surrounding forest, long abandoned and overgrown with weeds. The guide warned them to be careful along these tracks. "These lines haven't seen a train in decades," he said. "The metal is old, the ground uneven, and the ties can be rotten. Stick together, please." The students obeyed, though the allure of exploring the long stretch of rails was hard to resist. As they walked further into the forested section, the wind carried the soft rustle of leaves and the occasional call of birds. The rails disappeared into shadows cast by towering pines, giving the area an eerie sense of quiet isolation. The group joked nervously about ghost trains, sharing stories they had heard from friends or seen in movies. The guide smiled, indulging their curiosity, but clearly uncomfortable with the subject. Without warning, a piercing whistle shattered the calm. The sound was loud, sharp, and impossibly close. Students jumped, some screaming in surprise, while others froze, eyes wide. The ground beneath them trembled as if a massive weight were approaching, and a blinding light appeared at the far end of the track, roaring toward them. Panic erupted. The students scrambled off the rails, grabbing each other's arms, shouting, and tripping over roots and stones. The light intensified, a glaring beam that seemed to stretch forever, and the vibration of the ground grew stronger, reverberating through their bones. They expected to see a train emerge from the trees, its wheels crushing the tracks, its horn blaring again. But nothing came. The light passed by them in a flash, leaving only the sound of the wind and the faint echo of the whistle fading into the forest. The students stood frozen, hearts pounding, eyes scanning the tracks for any sign of a locomotive. The rails were empty. Not a single train appeared, no smoke, no engine, no rumble, except what had already passed. The guide caught up to them, his face pale, voice strained. It's not the first time," he admitted, glancing nervously down the tracks. "Other visitors have reported the same thing. A train that doesn't exist, a whistle in the night. Some call it the phantom train." The students exchanged bewildered glances. Whispers rippled through the group as they recounted what they had seen and felt. The light, the vibration, the eerie sound of a whistle that had no source. The guide explained that the phantom train was part of local legend. Decades ago, the line had been used by passenger trains, some of which had derailed in storms or accidents. Locals claimed that the spirits of engineers and passengers still traveled the rails, visible only as light and sound to those who wandered too close. Skeptical students argued with one another, suggesting it had been a reflection, a trick of the light, or a nearby car horn echoing strangely through the forest. But their photos and recordings told another story. Several students had snapped pictures of the tracks just as the blinding light passed, and in each image there was a strange glow hovering above the rails, too precise and vivid to be explained away as sunlight or lens flare. The guide led them back along the overgrown path, constantly looking over his shoulder. His usual enthusiasm for storytelling was replaced with a grim seriousness. "This line was abandoned for a reason," he said. "We've always respected it, but there's something lingering out here. I've been coming here for years, and I've heard it myself. A train that rides these tracks long after the last engine stopped running." By the time they returned to the main museum grounds, the students were quiet, each lost in thought. The excitement and thrill of the trip had been replaced by unease. Many found it difficult to laugh or joke about ghost trains for the rest of the day. Even the forest seemed to loom more heavily, its shadows carrying a weight they could feel. At the hostel that evening, some students tried to research the legend, reading old newspaper accounts of derailments and accidents on the abandoned line. The stories varied, but the recurring theme was the same. Witnesses described whistles, lights, and trains that appeared on tracks long after they had been decommissioned. As they drifted to sleep, the sound of the wind outside carried a faint whistle through the trees. Some of the students sat up in bed, listening, wondering if the phantom train had followed them, keeping its vigil along the rails that still seemed to hum beneath the earth. Years later, many of the students who had witnessed it still recalled the experience vividly. The memory of the blinding light, the vibrating ground, and the impossible whistle haunted them. Some claimed to hear trains in the distance when walking near tracks, and they always wondered whether the phantom train continued to ride the rails. A ghostly reminder of a time when steam and steel ruled the land, and a warning that some tracks are never truly abandoned. The historic mansion loomed atop a gentle hill, its brick walls and ivy-covered facades hinting at centuries of stories hidden within. A group of high school students had arrived for a field trip, eager to explore the sprawling estate and hear tales of the families who once lived there. The teachers guided them through ornate hallways and into rooms filled with antiques, faded portraits, and furniture that had seen generations pass. The students moved from room to room, marveling at the craftsmanship, the old books, and the delicate lace curtains that swayed slightly in the warm breeze from open windows. Guides shared stories of the mansion's history, banquets held in grand dining halls, balls in crystal-lit ballrooms, and the tragic fates of some of the residents. Whispers of ghostly sightings were mentioned quietly, almost as an afterthought, and the students laughed nervously, some snapping photos, while others whispered speculation to their friends. After a couple of hours, the group was ready to leave. They gathered their belongings and followed the teachers down the winding driveway to the waiting bus. The sun was beginning to dip toward the horizon, casting long shadows across the grounds. The students chatted about their favorite rooms, some joking about whether the mansion was haunted, while others remained unusually quiet, their eyes still drawn to the windows and the corners of the estate, as if expecting something or someone to appear. They climbed aboard the bus, settling into their seats with the usual mixture of excitement and fatigue that comes at the end of a long day. The driver started the engine, and the bus slowly rolled down the hill, past the sprawling gardens and the Ration gates. The air inside the vehicle was warm and smelled faintly of pencil shavings and snack wrappers, the kind of ordinary scent that made it hard to believe anything unusual could have followed them from the mansion. That's when one of the students noticed it. A handprint appeared on the fogged window near the front of the bus. At first it looked like condensation, but the shape was unmistakable. A palm, fingers splayed wide. What made it more unsettling was its size. It was much larger than any student's hand, stretching unnaturally across the glass. The students leaned closer, their faces pressing near the cold window, eyes wide with disbelief. "Did someone do that?" one whispered. A boy shook his head, pointing to his own hands. "No way. That's bigger than mine," he said, his voice trembling. The teacher at the front of the bus, trying to remain calm, approached and wiped the window with a sleeve. The handprint vanished under the cloth, leaving only clear glass behind. Relief washed over the students briefly, and a few of them laughed nervously, chalking it up to fog and condensation. But a few minutes later, the bus rounded a bend, and the teacher glanced at the same window. The handprint was back larger and more defined than before. This time, the edges were smudged slightly, as if something had pressed against the glass and then slowly lifted. The students gasped in unison, some gripping the backs of seats, others huddling together in fear. The teacher's face paled. She reached up and wiped the window again, brushing harder this time, insisting that it was condensation, maybe a streak left by a glove or a coat. The bus rattled over a patch of uneven road, the hum of the engine filling the tense silence. But no matter how many times she wiped, the handprint reappeared, fresh and distinct each time. The students whispered among themselves, sharing stories of ghosts and spirits they had heard about during the mansion tour. One girl swore she could see faint fingers moving, curling and stretching ever so slightly, as though something was still pressing against the glass from outside. Panic began to spread through the bus, quiet at first, then louder as each child realized the impossibility of the situation. The handprint didn't belong to any of them, and it wasn't fading. It was there, larger than life, an unexplainable mark that seemed to mock their attempts to erase it. The teacher tried to regain control, instructing the students to focus on something else, to look forward at the road. But even with their backs turned, the atmosphere inside the bus had changed. The air felt heavier, almost charged, as if the unseen presence that had left the print lingered with them, pressing against the edges of the bus. Minutes dragged on, the repetition of wiping and reappearing handprints leaving everyone unnerved. Some students kept glancing toward the window, expecting movement, expecting to see something materialize beyond the glass. The teacher finally admitted aloud that she didn't know what was causing it, her voice tight with unease. "Some things," she said slowly, "are beyond explanation. Let's just keep moving and get back to school." Even as the bus rolled down familiar streets, the handprint remained in the minds of the students. No one spoke of it loudly, but their glances kept returning to the window, half expecting the mark to leap into view again. By the time they arrived at the school and climbed down from the bus, the ordinary world seemed to reclaim them, the sunlight washing away the tension of the ride. Yet, even after the students left, the memory of the handprint lingered. Photographs taken during the trip seemed to show faint impressions on the glass where the hand had been, and some of the students swore they could feel cold fingers brushing their arms when they thought about it. The mansion, once a distant and charming location for a field trip, had left its mark not just on the glass, but on the minds of everyone who had witnessed it. Long after the trip ended, the story circulated among the students. They whispered about the handprint, about the possibility that it belonged to someone or something that still wandered the mansion's halls, watching, waiting, leaving reminders that some histories and some presences refused to fade away. The joint school trip had brought together students from 2 neighboring towns for a day of workshops, games, and collaborative learning. Excitement buzzed through the hallways of the older school building, its brick walls worn and ivy climbing the corners. The principal greeted everyone warmly and led the groups to classrooms where activities were set up. Between sessions, small groups of students wandered the hallways. A group of friends, drawn by curiosity, found themselves at the far end of a dimly lit corridor. The air here was cooler, carrying the faint scent of chalk dust and old wood. Fluorescent lights flickered intermittently, casting long shadows across the floor. Whispers of older students, tales of abandoned classrooms, strange noises, and doors that led nowhere had circulated among them, and the corridor's quiet atmosphere gave those stories an almost believable weight. At the end of the hall, a plain wooden door stood slightly ajar. A narrow window at the top allowed a sliver of light to escape, inviting the students closer. "Do you think anyone still uses this?" one girl whispered. Her friend shrugged but felt a shiver of anticipation as they pushed the door open. Inside, they found a classroom frozen in time. Desks were neatly arranged in rows, chairs tucked in, books lying open on the tables. A chalkboard at the front still bore faint traces of writing. The room smelled faintly of dust and old paper, and the sunlight filtering through the windows dusted the furniture in a warm, golden glow. The students froze, taking in the strange scene. "It's like everyone just left," one whispered, "like they were waiting to come back but never did." They moved carefully among the desks, running fingers over the covers of books and peeking at faded notes on the chalkboard. The air felt heavy, almost charged, as if the room itself were holding its breath. Shadows stretched unnaturally across the floor, and the sound of their footsteps echoed strangely in the quiet space. After several minutes, they decided to show a teacher. They ran back down the hall, voices low and anxious. When they returned with an adult, pointing excitedly toward the door, the hallway was suddenly unremarkable. The door was gone. In its place was an uninterrupted wall, painted the same dull beige as the rest of the corridor. There was no window, no sign that a classroom had ever existed there. The teacher checked the map and consulted the school's records. "There's no room here," she said, frowning. "This wing has been unused for years. Are you sure of the location?" The students insisted, describing the exact details: the door's chipped paint, the dust patterns on the floor, the open books, and the arrangement of desks. But even with their detailed recollections, the room could not be found. Other doors in the wing led only to storage closets or locked stairwells. No corridor, no classroom matched what they had seen. Some of the older students recalled vague rumors about an abandoned classroom sealed off decades ago. But there were no records, no photographs, and no living staff who remembered it. The principal confirmed that the official blueprints and archives contained no mention of a classroom at that exact spot. The group left the corridor with a sense of unease, unable to shake the vivid memory of the room. They recounted what they had seen in hushed tones, debating whether it had been a shared hallucination or something inexplicable. The scene, the open books, the arranged desks, the faint smell of chalk, dust remained vivid in their minds. Even after returning to their own school, the story persisted. Students found themselves recalling small details: the dust motes dancing in the sunlight, the chalkboard's faint markings, and the unsettling feeling that the room had been waiting for them. Some admitted to seeing glimpses of it in dreams, just at the edge of vision, always familiar but just out of reach. The locked classroom became a legend among the students. A haunting reminder of a place that existed for a brief moment and then vanished. Though many dismissed it as imagination or youthful fancy, those who had stepped inside knew the truth. They had entered a room that should not exist, a classroom frozen in time, waiting silently for students who never returned, and leaving behind a mystery that defied explanation. The coastal inn sat perched on a bluff overlooking the restless waves, its weathered exterior battered by wind and salt spray. A group of high school students had arrived for an overnight field trip, excited for the chance to spend a night away from home, explore the shoreline, and enjoy a change of scenery. The inn was charming in a faded, old-world way, with creaking floors, narrow staircases, and hallways that smelled faintly of sea air and polished wood. After check-in, the students were shown to their rooms. Laughter and chatter echoed down the corridors as they unpacked, played card games, and shared stories. Teachers reminded them of curfew and the importance of staying in their rooms once the lights were out. Despite these warnings, curiosity pulled some students to peek out into the hallways, whispering to one another about the inn's age and the creaks and groans of the structure settling with the night. As midnight passed and the wind howled against the windows, most of the students drifted into sleep. The inn was quiet, save for the occasional crash of waves below and the rhythmic ticking of an ancient clock in the lobby. Then, shortly after 3 in the morning, several students stirred simultaneously, pulled awake by an almost imperceptible sound, the soft, gliding shuffle of movement down the hallway. One girl rubbed her eyes and glanced toward the open door. In the dim light of the hallway, she froze. A woman in black was moving gracefully along the corridor, her long dress flowing as if carried by an unseen current. What struck the students most was that the figure's feet never seemed to touch the floor. She hovered, gliding silently past room doors, her presence both ethereal and unnerving. She's floating," whispered another student, clutching the blanket. Hearts pounded in unison as the group watched, paralyzed with a mixture of fear and disbelief. The woman's face was partially obscured by shadows, but the outline of her features hinted at something sorrowful, almost mournful. The gliding figure paused near a painting, seeming to look down the hallway before continuing her silent procession. The students dared not speak, afraid that any noise might draw attention. Some hid beneath their covers, peering cautiously through the cracks in the blanket, while others remained frozen on the beds, eyes wide and hearts racing. The figure passed slowly, as if aware of being observed, yet she did not interact with the living in any way. After what felt like an eternity, she reached the end of the hall and vanished into the shadows, leaving behind an eerie stillness. The students held their breath, listening to the soft hum of the inn and the distant pounding of the surf below. They whispered among themselves, questioning whether they had truly seen what their eyes had reported. Morning arrived, and with it, a sense of relief that daylight seemed to bring. During breakfast, the students recounted the event to each other in hushed tones, each adding small details that made the story more vivid. When they mentioned it to the inn's staff, the reactions were polite, but uninformed. "I'm sure it was just a dream," one of the clerks said, smiling gently. "These old buildings can play tricks on the mind, especially at night. The shadows move differently when the lights are low, and our hallways are long." But the students knew what they had seen. Some pointed out the direction the woman had glided, the way the dress floated above the floor, and the stillness in the air around her. Others mentioned the chilling sorrow in the figure's posture, an intangible weight that had pressed against them as she passed. Curious and skeptical, one of the students asked if the security cameras had recorded anything unusual. The staff checked the footage and returned a few minutes later. "Nothing," they said. "No one passed through the halls, and nothing appears on the video. Perhaps it was just your imagination, or a very vivid dream." The students exchanged uneasy glances. While the cameras showed nothing, their memories were undeniable. The soundless glide, the black dress, the feeling of being observed, and the inexplicable sensation that someone or something had lingered in the hallway long after she disappeared. The day passed in relative normalcy, though the group remained subdued. No one spoke loudly about the incident, but the students stole glances down corridors, half expecting to see the gliding figure once more. Teachers reassured them, suggesting it was a combination of fatigue, excitement, and the inn's eerie atmosphere. Still, a lingering tension persisted. That evening, the students boarded the bus for their return home, and the coastal inn receded in the distance. The memory of the figure in black clung to their minds, vivid and persistent. Even in sunlight, the corridors of the inn seemed to stretch long and silent in their imaginations. The faint echo of her passage lingering like a shadow. In the years that followed, many of the students remembered that night as one of the most unsettling experiences of their youth. They could recall the exact details of the black dress, the way her feet never touched the floor, and the eerie quiet that had pressed in on them as she glided past. The in itself became a story whispered among classmates and shared with younger students on subsequent trips. A tale of a corridor where the living brushed against something that should not exist. A ghostly presence that no camera could ever capture. Though some dismissed the story as a shared dream, those who had witnessed it knew better. The woman in black had moved silently through the hallway, a lingering presence caught between the past and the present. Her gliding steps, a reminder that some places, especially old buildings by the sea, keep memories and spirits long after the living have left. The desert stretched endlessly, a sun-baked expanse of ochre and rust, dotted with jagged rock formations and sparse scrub. A group of high school students had arrived for a field trip to a renowned paleontological site, eager to dig, explore, and uncover the ancient remnants of life that had been buried for millions of years. The guide, a seasoned archaeologist with a weathered hat and sunburned neck, briefed the students on safety and proper digging techniques, emphasizing respect for the fragile fossils they hoped to uncover. Armed with small shovels, brushes, and excitement, the students spread out across the designated dig area. Dust rose in pale clouds as they scraped and brushed at the rocky ground, uncovering fragments of prehistoric life, pieces of shell, the tips of claws, and the faint curve of fossilized vertebrae. Laughter and conversation mingled with the occasional gasp of discovery, the dry wind carrying their voices across the barren landscape. One boy, Thomas, moved carefully along a small ridge, brushing away dirt from a slightly protruding shape. His heart raced as he realized he was uncovering something unusual. At first, it looked like a fragment of bone, weathered and gray from millennia of exposure. But as he dug more carefully, he realized the shape was distinctly human-like, a long, slender bone, partially embedded in the sand. "Guys, come look at this," he called, his voice tinged with awe and a little fear. A few of his friends hurried over, peering at the bone. The guide approached, frowning slightly. He said, examining it. "It could be a fragment of a prehistoric mammal, but that does have a very human shape. We'll need to catalog it and check it properly in the lab." Thomas's stomach twisted with unease. Holding the bone in his hands, he felt a cold shiver run through him, though the sun beat down relentlessly. He placed it carefully in a labeled bag, trying to ignore the strange feeling that accompanied it as if the desert itself were watching. The group continued digging until late afternoon, the sun sinking low, casting long shadows over the excavation site. Finally, they packed up their tools and returned to the campsite, tents pitched near a cluster of flat rocks. That night, after dinner and a brief discussion around a small fire, the students crawled into their sleeping bags, exhausted from the day's labor. Thomas placed the bone in his tent bag, feeling a weight in the pit of his stomach. Sleep did not come easily. He tossed and turned, the desert's cold night air seeping through the thin fabric of his sleeping bag. Around 3 in the morning, a sudden chill ran over him, and he felt as if he were being watched. His eyes snapped open, and he saw a shadow in the corner of the tent. At first, he thought it was one of his friends, teasing him, but as he focused, he realized the shadow had shape tall, dark, and indistinct but unmistakably upright, looming over him. Thomas screamed, scrambling to sit up. The figure remained, silent and unmoving, its presence pressing down on him. He could hear his own heartbeat, thundering in his ears, and the sound of the desert wind whipping past the tent. He called out, but his voice cracked with terror. Morning came with a blinding sun and the distant cawing of ravens. Thomas awoke, sweating and trembling, convinced he had seen something impossible. His friends crowded around, concerned by the sounds of his screams. He explained what had happened, gesturing toward the corner of the tent, where he had felt the shadow. Together, they reached for the bag containing the bone. It was gone. The carefully labeled fossil, the one he had held in his hands just hours earlier, had vanished without a trace. Thomas checked the surrounding tent floor, the straps of his backpack, even the small storage box the guide had given them for collected specimens. Nothing. The bag was empty. The bone gone, as if it had never existed. The guide arrived, concerned by the commotion. Thomas recounted his discovery, the shadow, and the bone's disappearance. The guide frowned, listening quietly, his brow furrowing in thought. Sometimes, he said finally, choosing his words carefully, these sites have energies, if you will. Fossils hold echoes of the past, remnants of lives long gone. Occasionally, people report feeling watched, or objects shifting mysteriously. It's rare, but it happens. The students murmured nervously, exchanging uneasy glances. Thomas couldn't shake the feeling that the shadow had been drawn to the bone, as if something had claimed it during the night. A weight lingered in the air, a sense that the desert itself was hiding secrets deeper than any excavation could uncover. For the remainder of the trip, Thomas and his friends dug and explored, but the unease never fully lifted. Every shadow, every rustle of the wind over the rocks, seemed to echo the memory of that night. When they returned home, Thomas kept the story to himself, unwilling to be dismissed as over-imaginative. In later years, he often thought about the fossil, the shape of the bone, the cold presence at the edge of his vision, and the way it had vanished. Paleontologists may have records of countless discoveries, but Thomas knew there were things no record could capture. Moments when the past brushed against the present, when the earth whispered secrets, and when something buried for millennia made itself known. If only briefly, to those brave or foolish enough to dig. The fossil dig became a memory that never faded, a reminder that some discoveries are not meant to be held, some bones are not meant to be owned, and some presences, unseen yet undeniable, watch over the sands, waiting for the curious hands of the living to uncover what should remain buried. The colonial era mansion stood at the edge of a sprawling estate, its brick walls weathered by centuries of wind and rain. A high school history class had arrived for a field trip, eager to explore the ornate rooms, antique furnishings, and the stories embedded in the mansion's walls. The guide, an older woman with a calm voice and sharp eyes, led the students through the grand entrance, pointing out the hand-carved staircases, intricate crown molding. After touring the foyer and the main hall, the group entered the parlor, a large room filled with velvet drapes, polished wood floors, and furniture so delicate it looked like it could crumble under the weight of a finger. Against the far wall stood a massive antique mirror, framed in gold leaf and carved with intricate patterns that twisted like vines. Its glass was slightly wavy, evidence of its age, and it reflected the room with a subtle distortion that made the chandelier look taller than it was, and the windows appear more luminous than reality allowed. The guide paused in front of the mirror. "This is one of the mansion's most notable artifacts," she said. "It has been here for over 200 years. I must insist, do not touch it. Even the slightest pressure can damage the glass and frame. Treat it with respect, and you will see why it has fascinated visitors for generations." The students nodded, some taking notes, others whispering to their friends about how beautiful the mirror looked. Among them was a boy named Lucas, curious and stubborn, who lingered behind the group. While the others moved on to inspect the parlor's furniture, Lucas edged closer to the mirror. The warnings of the guide echoed in his mind, but a strange impulse drew him forward. He reached out and pressed his hand flat against the cold surface of the glass. The reflection rippled slightly beneath his palm, as if the mirror itself were breathing. A shiver ran down his spine, but he laughed quietly, thinking it was just a trick of the light. He pulled his hand back and rejoined the group, brushing off the feeling that had briefly gripped him. The rest of the tour continued uneventfully. with the students exploring the dining room, the library, and the upstairs bedrooms. Lucas tried to push the mirror from his mind, but a subtle unease lingered, a sensation that the room more, the glass itself, was watching him even as he left. Later that week, the class's photographs from the trip were developed. Excited chatter filled the classroom as students passed around prints of themselves posing in front of grand staircases, antique furniture, and the mansion's gardens. Lucas noticed something strange when he looked at the photos from the parlor. In every picture, he was missing. His friends were there, laughing and smiling, standing exactly where he had been in reality. But in the final prints, he was gone. The spot he had occupied was empty, as if he had never been there at all. Confused, Lucas showed the photos to his friends. They examined them closely. "That's impossible," one of the students said. "You were definitely in those photos when we took them." "I know I was," Lucas insisted, his voice shaking. "I was standing right there. I pressed my hand to the mirror." That's when his words faltered. He couldn't articulate the strange, cold sensation that had stayed with him after touching the glass. The teacher called the school's photography teacher, who examined the negatives. "The negatives show the same thing, the mirror, the room, everyone else, but he's missing. I've never seen anything like it." Rumors spread quickly among the students. Some whispered that the mirror was cursed, a relic that somehow erased anyone who touched it from photographs, as if the reflection could absorb a person's presence. Others suggested it was a trick of the old glass, a distortion in the surface that somehow affected the camera's lens. Lucas couldn't shake the feeling that it was more than a trick. He remembered the ripple when he pressed his hand to the glass, the subtle warmth that seemed to spread through his palm, and the sensation of being looked at by something unseen. Weeks later, Lucas returned to the mansion with his family. He hesitated at the parlor doorway, staring at the antique mirror as if expecting it to move. He reached out instinctively, and the glass shimmered faintly beneath his fingertips. His parents laughed, thinking it was just a reflection in the sunlight. But Lucas felt a twinge of fear, remembering the photographs and the emptiness where he should have appeared. The experience stayed with him for years. Whenever he saw an antique mirror, he felt the same subtle pull, the sensation that the glass could hide, distort, or even take what was real. He told the story rarely, and only to those he trusted. The photos remained a silent testament, a class of students in the parlor, everyone smiling, laughing, existing except Lucas, whose presence had vanished like smoke in a draft. The mansion continued to stand, centuries old, its mirror gleaming quietly in the parlor. Visitors came and went, some curious, some skeptical, and some, like Lucas, left with a lingering sense of unease. The antique glass waited patiently, reflecting the room with all its beauty, yet holding the secret that anyone daring to touch it might discover: that some reflections are not harmless, and that a moment of curiosity can leave a person erased from memory, leaving only the echo of a vanished presence. The day had been filled with excitement and curiosity. A high school biology class had spent the morning exploring a sprawling wildlife preserve, walking along winding trails and observing animals in their natural habitats. The preserve was famous for its diverse species and breathtaking scenery, and the students had spent hours photographing birds, tracking deer footprints, and listening to the calls of unseen creatures echoing through the forest. Laughter and chatter had filled the air as they shared discoveries, compared notes, and joked about who would see the first fox or snake. By mid-afternoon, the group was ready to return home. The bus waited near the preserve's entrance, its familiar yellow paint gleaming in the sunlight. Students piled in, still buzzing from the day's adventures, talking over each other to describe their favorite moments. Cameras clicked as they captured last glimpses of the trails, the towering oaks, and the distant mountains. The driver, a middle-aged man with decades of experience navigating rural roads, smiled but remained silent, focusing on preparing the vehicle for the journey. As the bus pulled away, the mood was light and carefree. Friends leaned across aisles to show photos, snacks were passed around, and teachers reminded the students to stay seated. The bus rolled down the winding roads, hugging tight curves and navigating narrow passages lined with dense trees. The sun began to dip lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the asphalt and turning the forest into a patchwork of gold and dark green. Then, just as the students were joking about who had seen the largest deer, the driver slammed on the brakes. The sudden stop threw several students forward in their seats, the screech of tires filling the air. Shouts and surprised gasps followed, and the bus lurched to a halt in the middle of the road. "What happened?" someone cried, their voice trembling. The driver didn't answer immediately. He stayed silent, staring straight ahead. Through the windshield, the students saw her. A girl in white stood in the center of the narrow road, pale and still. Her dress fluttered slightly in the breeze, her long hair hanging loose around her shoulders. She didn't move toward the bus, didn't wave or speak. She simply stood there, her eyes fixed on the vehicle. "She's just a person," one student whispered, trying to rationalize it. "Maybe she's lost or something." But as the students strained to look more closely, the girl seemed almost unreal. Her feet didn't disturb the dust on the road, and her presence carried an unnatural stillness that made the hair on the back of their necks stand up. The laughter and chatter that had filled the bus moments earlier vanished, replaced by tense silence. The driver, still gripping the wheel, finally spoke in a low, tight voice. "Stay calm. Don't make any sudden movements." He didn't move the bus, didn't honk, and didn't try to speak to the girl. The students watched, hearts pounding, unsure of what would happen next. And then she was gone. One moment she stood motionless in the road, and the next, as if swallowed by the shadows of the trees, she vanished completely. There was no sign of her dress, no footprints, not even a disturbance in the dust. The students looked at each other in confusion and fear, some whispering questions they dared not speak aloud. The driver slowly eased the bus forward, navigating the winding road with a practiced hand, but without glancing at the place where the girl had been. Every pair of eyes inside the bus searched the roadside, scanning the tree line and the fields beyond, but there was no trace of the girl. Only the empty road stretched ahead, silent except for the hum of the bus engine. Finally, one brave student asked, "Did anyone see her?" The driver's face remained expressionless. He shook his head slightly, his jaw tight. "Just keep looking forward. Don't talk about it," he said quietly, his voice carrying an unmistakable firmness. He refused to elaborate, and when pressed further, he only shook his head again, staring ahead as if the road itself demanded their attention. The rest of the ride passed in tense, uneasy silence. The students avoided glancing at the roadside, choosing instead to focus on the familiar landmarks they knew would lead them back to town. Some tried to joke to break the tension, but the memory of the girl in white lingered, a ghostly imprint on their minds. Occasionally, a student would glance at the bus mirrors, half expecting to see her reflected among the seats, only to find empty aisles and rows of their friends staring back. When they finally reached the school, the teachers helped the students off the bus, trying to calm the lingering fear. Many whispered to each other, replaying the image of the girl, her stillness, and the sudden disappearance. No one on the bus had an explanation, and the driver, as always, refused to speak about it. He guided the students inside without a word, leaving the road behind them empty and silent. Even weeks later, the memory persisted. Students found themselves recalling the girl's pale dress, her quiet presence, and the surreal moment when she vanished. They debated rational explanations, someone playing a prank, a trick of the light, fatigue, but no explanation felt complete. The driver's silence, the unwavering stillness of the girl, and the impossibility of her disappearance made the experience unforgettable. It became a story they told in hushed tones to friends, a shared mystery that none could fully explain. The wildlife preserve had offered them a day of wonder and discovery, but the bus ride home had left a mark deeper than any field guide or observation. A presence had crossed their path, a fleeting vision in white, leaving only fear, fascination, and the unshakable sense that some things on the road are not meant to be seen or explained. The college trip had promised a mix of history and thrill. A group of students from a psychology program had arranged a guided tour of the ruins of an abandoned asylum on the outskirts of their town. The building had been shuttered for decades, left to the elements after stories of neglect, overcrowding, and strange occurrences had tarnished its reputation. Yet, its crumbling walls, rusted gates, an overgrown courtyard held an irresistible fascination for the students, many of whom were eager to document the eerie setting for their research and photography projects. As they arrived, the late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the cracked pavement and shattered windows of the asylum. Vines crawled along the brick walls, and the air carried the faint scent of mold and decay. The tour guide, a local historian with a deep knowledge of the asylum's past, led the group through the main entrance, warning them to stay together and avoid areas that were structurally unsound. The students explored room after room, noting the peeling paint, rusting metal beds, and the remnants of once bright murals, now dulled by time. In the common areas, they photographed scattered personal items, old medical equipment, and the occasional yellowed document. Despite the desolation, there was a strange energy in the air, a lingering presence that seemed to brush against the edges of perception. Laughter and conversation echoed oddly off the empty walls, giving the building an uncanny life of its own. One girl, Emily, was particularly drawn to the peeling walls and the faded patterns left behind. She lingered behind the group, her camera snapping photos of textures and shadows that fascinated her. The air inside smelled more pungent than the rest of the asylum, a mix of mildew, dust, and something she couldn't quite identify. Emily stepped inside, brushing past a doorframe carefully. The room was small, the walls flaking with thick layers of peeling paint, and the floorboards warped and creaking under her weight. At first it appeared empty, but then she saw them more. Thought she did. Figures sitting on the beds, hunched over, silent, their faces obscured by shadows. Their clothes were tattered, their postures strange and stiff, like mannequins frozen in time. Her breath caught in her throat, and for a moment, she convinced herself it was a trick of the light, the angles of the room, or her imagination. Yet when she raised her camera to take a photo, she saw the figures move ever so slightly, shifting in their seats, tilting their heads, as though aware of her presence. Emily called out softly, hoping someone from the group would answer, but there was only silence. The muffled voices and laughter of her classmates seemed far away, as if the walls had swallowed the sound. Fear prickled her skin, but fascination held her rooted in place. She studied the figures, noticing the details of their worn clothes, the hollow look in their faces, the subtle sway of their bodies. She whispered, "Hello," and one of them tilted its head more sharply, as if responding. Suddenly, a voice from the corridor snapped her back to reality. "Emily, come on," one of her friends called. She hesitated, glancing once more at the room, then stepped out and hurried to catch up. When she returned to the group, everyone laughed nervously at her pale face, joking about getting lost or overreacting. She tried to explain what she had seen, but none of the others reported noticing anything unusual, and the tour continued without incident. Back at the dorm that night, Emily struggled to sleep. Images of the figures haunted her mind, their silent presence, the hollow eyes, the feeling that they had acknowledged her. She thought she could feel them lingering in the shadows of her room, their presence pressing lightly on the edges of her consciousness. Around midnight, she awoke screaming, convinced the figures had followed her from the asylum. Her roommates rushed to calm her, finding her trembling eyes wide with terror, unable to articulate the specifics of what she had experienced. The next day, Emily recounted the experience to the tour guide and some classmates. They listened politely but remained skeptical, attributing her fear to the atmospheric ruins, fatigue, and a mind primed to see patterns in decay. Yet Emily couldn't shake the memory of the figures sitting patiently, waiting in the peeling paint, or the sense that their attention had extended beyond the asylum's walls. Even weeks later, she remained unsettled. Shadows seemed to linger longer than they should. Corners of empty rooms felt slightly too deep, and occasionally, she would swear she glimpsed hunched forms in her peripheral vision. She never returned to that wing of the asylum, but the memory of the visit persisted vividly in her mind. A haunting reminder of a place where the past still clung, waiting for someone to notice, waiting for someone to see. The asylum itself continued to decay, abandoned and silent. its walls harboring memories of countless lives confined and forgotten. For Emily, and perhaps for others who dared to explore it, it was a place alive with echoes, where the line between reality and the lingering presence of the past blurred, leaving a lasting imprint on those who walked its halls and glimpsed the unseen. The day had begun like any other field trip, filled with excitement, laughter, and the eager chatter of high school students. Their destination was a pioneer village, a recreated settlement designed to show visitors what life had been like in the 1800s. Weathered wooden buildings, hand-carved tools, and winding dirt paths transported the students back in time. Teachers and guides explained the history of the area, demonstrating blacksmithing, weaving, and the careful methods settlers had used to farm the land. The students explored the village in small groups, peering into cabins furnished with rough-hewn tables, straw-stuffed mattresses, and oil lamps suspended from the ceilings. They touched the old tools, smelled the faint scent of smoke from the chimneys, and marveled at the simplicity of life in a time before electricity and modern conveniences. There was a palpable sense of curiosity, and many students took out their phones or cameras to capture the experience. Midway through the afternoon, the teacher in charge decided to take a group photo to commemorate the trip. Everyone gathered in front of the village's main square, the rustic buildings forming a perfect backdrop. Students jostled for position, arms slung around friends' shoulders, smiles wide and teeth shining in the sunlight. The teacher adjusted the camera, counted down, and snapped the photo. Laughter erupted as the camera clicked, and the group quickly dispersed to continue exploring the village. Later, back on the bus, the students chatted excitedly, reviewing the day's adventures and swapping stories about which building or artifact had been their favorite. Once they returned to school, the teacher printed the photo and displayed it in the classroom. Students crowded around, eager to see themselves, their friends, and the memory frozen in time. Everyone pointed out themselves, comparing heights and positions, laughing at who had made funny faces. Then, a girl named Sophie noticed something unusual. In the back row, between two students she recognized, stood a man. At first, she thought it might be a teacher who had stepped in, but the man's clothing immediately caught her attention. He wore a frock coat, a wide-brimmed hat, and trousers that looked like they had come straight from the 1800s. His expression was stern and unfamiliar, and his posture rigid, as if he had been standing for a formal portrait. "Wait," Sophie said, pointing at the photo. "Who is that?" The other students leaned in, squinting at the image. A few chuckled nervously. "That's weird. I don't remember anyone like that being there," one said. "I swear," Sophie continued, "he wasn't standing there when we took the picture. I'd remember a guy dressed like that." The teacher, curious, came over and examined the photo. She frowned. "I don't recall anyone like this in the group. I would have noticed someone in a frock coat and top hat, standing right in the middle. Did anyone see him when we were lining up?" The students shook their heads. No one had remembered the man, and the guide who had led the village tour confirmed that no one, matching that description, had been present during the photo. The image clearly showed him, however, his shoes dusted with dirt, hands folded in front of him, and a neutral, almost somber expression. Speculation ran rampant. Some students joked that it was a mistake or a trick of the camera, perhaps a double exposure or a photographer's error. Others felt uneasy, unable to explain why the figure seemed so out of place, so convincingly from another time. Some students whispered that the village itself had been haunted by the spirits of the pioneers who had once lived there, claiming that their presence occasionally manifested to remind visitors of their past. Sophie could not shake the image from her mind. Every time she thought about the day, she remembered the photo. The way the man's eyes seemed fixed, almost intelligent, as if he was silently observing them. She imagined him stepping through the back row while no one noticed, slipping between the gaps of memory and reality. Over the next few weeks, the photo circulated among students. Each time someone looked closely, they noticed the tiny details: the stitching on his coat, the shine of his shoes, the subtle difference in the way light fell on him compared to everyone else. It was almost as if he had been captured by the camera in a way no human could naturally appear. Some students reported feeling strange sensations when looking at the photo, a chill in the room, The sense of being watched, a shiver that ran along the spine. Sophie herself occasionally thought she saw him move in the corner of her eye while staring at the photo. Though she knew logically that was impossible. The man remained a mystery. No one could identify him. No one remembered seeing him, and no record existed of anyone dressed in pioneer clothing wandering among the students that day. The photograph became a source of quiet fascination and unease. A reminder that sometimes history does not stay in the past, that the lives captured in old villages and forgotten settlements might still linger, waiting for someone to notice. Even years later, when Sophie and her classmates reminisced about the trip, their conversations inevitably returned to the photograph. The man in the back row remained, frozen in time, a ghostly presence among the living, his expression unchanged, his identity unknown, and his presence impossible to explain. The field trip, meant to teach about history and exploration, had inadvertently left them with a glimpse into something far older, a fleeting connection to a past that refused to be ignored. The class had been eagerly anticipating the mountain field trip for weeks. Nestled in the northern ranges, the lodge was a rustic retreat surrounded by towering pines, craggy cliffs, and winding trails that promised adventure and discovery. Students had spent the morning hiking through narrow paths, photographing waterfalls, and learning about local wildlife from a park ranger. The air was crisp and clean, carrying the scent of pine needles and damp earth. And gathered in the common room to recount the day's adventures. The lodge's large windows framed the mountains beyond, bathed in the soft glow of the setting sun. Inside, the wood-paneled walls and stone fireplace gave the space a cozy warmth, a contrast to the chilly air outside. When it was time to leave for the bus, the teacher, Mr. Harlow, herded the students into a line near the entrance. He carried a clipboard and called out names, checking each against his list to ensure everyone was accounted for. "Roll call before we head out," he said, his voice firm but friendly. The students responded dutifully, one by one, calling out "here." As he checked their names, "Evelyn, here." Evelyn's voice rang out clearly, strong and confident. "Marcus, here." The roll continued smoothly, names called and answered, until Mr. Harlow reached the last name on the list. He paused, pen hovering over the clipboard, and waited. "Everyone's accounted for," he said. Relief passed through him, and he began to close the clipboard. Then, without warning, a voice called out from the line, or perhaps from the lodge itself, clear, deep, and unnervingly resonant. "Here." Mr. Harlow froze, glancing around at the students. The voice had echoed, reverberating through the wooden beams and across the stone walls, far louder than any single student could have projected. The students, startled, exchanged nervous glances. No one moved. No one admitted to speaking. Mr. Harlow asked, his tone calm but tense. The students shook their heads, murmuring to one another, "It wasn't me. I didn't say anything. Maybe it came from outside." The windows showed nothing unusual. The mountains stood silently in the distance, the trees swaying gently in the breeze. No other hikers or staff were visible, and the lodge itself had been quiet except for the sounds of the students' shoes on the wooden floor. Yet the voice had come from somewhere inside door, perhaps from everywhere at once. It seemed to fill the room, vibrating off the walls, resonating in a way that made it impossible to pinpoint its origin. Mr. Harlow took a deep breath, trying to steady his own unease. "All right," he said carefully. "Let's get moving. Everyone on the bus." He led the students outside, but the incident lingered in their minds, a thread of tension woven through their chatter. Even the bus driver glanced at the group curiously, noticing the sudden hush that had fallen over the students. As the bus wound down the mountain road, the students whispered to each other about the voice. Some speculated it had been an echo from the mountains themselves, a trick of acoustics amplified by the lodge's high ceilings and the surrounding cliffs. Others thought it might have been a stray ranger or hiker calling out, but no one seemed to match the deep, commanding tone they had heard. Emily, a quiet student who often noticed details others overlooked, whispered to her friend Liam. It sounded wrong, like it wasn't human, like the mountain itself spoke. Liam shivered, nodding. It wasn't any of us, and it wasn't someone outside. I don't know, but I don't think I want to call roll again anytime soon. That night, back at the dormitory, the students replayed the moment in their minds. The memory of the deep, resonant voice refused to fade. Some lay awake, imagining the lodge empty, the line of students frozen in place, the voice echoing through the wooden beams and across the mountains. It had sounded almost alive, as if the mountain itself had acknowledged them, confirming their presence with a single, deliberate word, here. The next day, when the group returned to school, they discussed the incident in hushed tones. No rational explanation satisfied everyone. Acoustics, echoes, or a prank by another student seemed inadequate to account for the richness and volume of the voice. It had carried authority and weight, an undeniable presence that lingered in the memory of all who had heard it. Years later, the students who had been on that trip still remembered the voice. They told the story quietly, to friends or family, always careful to leave room for the mystery. Some claimed to feel a strange sense of being watched when hiking in the mountains, a subtle pressure on the back of the neck, a whisper carried on the wind. Others dismissed it as a shared memory, heightened by imagination. Yet for the group that had called roll that day, the memory remained vivid, indelible, a reminder that the mountains, silent and imposing, sometimes responded in ways that could not be explained. The lodge continued to stand at the edge of the northern ranges, weathering storms, snow, and the slow passage of time. Visitors came and went, and the forests stretched endlessly beyond, still and watchful, for the students who had called roll that day. However, the mountains had spoken once, echoing through wood and stone, leaving behind a single, unforgettable answer. Here, and in that echo, a presence lingered, reminding them that some things in the world wait quietly, hidden in the ordinary, until they are noticed and then acknowledged with a voice that seems to belong not to a person, but to the land itself.
And there you have it. 20 true, scary field trip horror stories. Classrooms may feel safe, but the world outside holds mysteries, memories, and presences that don't always welcome visitors. Maybe next time you step onto a bus or wander through a museum, you'll remember these tales and keep an eye on the shadows lingering just out of sight. Thank you for joining me on tonight's journey through the haunted corners of our childhood adventures. Until next time, travel safely and never wander off alone.